We've talked before about the difference between cow's milk is great for baby cows, and if you're a human and you can consume it, fine. But there's some things we have to do to the cow milk to make it appropriate for humans that some people in the social spaces have decided is no longer necessary. I'm talking about raw milk, and this little thing happens in my stomach every time I think about it. But it's kind of, no offense to those of you who love it, gross. I'm sorry, I can't hide the ball. That's just how I feel about it. But I want to be diplomatic about this. I want to be scientific in our approach. You all know we believe in data here. This is not just an emotion-driven show. This is a show that's based on data, research, information. And joining me right now is Dr. Andrea Love, an immunologist and microbiologist with over a decade of experience in basic sciences, translational medicine, and clinical research. She's also a subject matter expert in infectious disease immunology, cancer immunology, and autoimmunity, and is adept at translating really complex scientific data and topics for those of us in the public. Y'all know I pretended I was a doctor when I was 7. It didn't actually happen because me and science didn't get along. She's the founder of Immunologic, which is a science and health education organization and newsletter geared towards addressing misinformation, which is so necessary right now. And she's the executive director of the American Lyme Disease Foundation, a columnist for Skeptical Inquirer, and the Genetic Literacy Project, and the author of an article entitled "Raw Milk is Not Safe to Drink and Doesn't Offer Unique Health Benefits." All of that and more. Dr. Andrea Love, it's a pleasure to have you here. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for being here. I never thought that we would have need to discuss this topic, but a few months ago, I began reading about this thing that we were learning more and more about, and it was this disease called, what is it, H5N1, or a virus. I don't even know what the proper terminology for it is, but it was feeling to me like the way I felt in the fall, or really the winter of 2019, when I was reading about this weird thing happening in China, and then early 2020, like what's happening in Italy and France. And so it felt very much the same. And so when I found your article, I was like, oh, we have to bring her on, because this H5N1 is in some ways, I think, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is that it may be getting a boost in its potential spread because of the consumption of products like raw milk. You've had a lot to say about this. Can you help us understand it from a public audience perspective? What are your thoughts on these topics?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you hit on a lot of the relevant topics. And so we started hearing about H5N1, which is a particular strain of influenza. So there are hundreds of different influenza viruses. And this particular one, H5N1, we normally call avian flu or bird flu, because that strain doesn't usually infect people. It typically infects birds, poultry, as well as wild birds, but we started seeing cases of H5N1 occurring not just in birds, but also in dairy cattle. And so that suggested that this particular strain of flu virus wasn't staying as restricted within those bird populations as we would typically expect. And so there was a lot of surveillance being done by the USDA, and they were finding that, yes, this virus was being passed among cows, farm to farm, and even across state lines. Now, the good news, at least right now, is that avian flu strains aren't really great at infecting people. And that's a good thing, because these particular flu viruses can cause very serious illness. Now, there have been some cases, though. And so that obviously opens up the door to, okay, well, what's actually facilitating it? Is it farm workers who are in really close proximity to all of these animals that are kind of the mixing vessels and are spreading this particular strain of flu virus? Is it people who are actually interacting with the milk products, and so on? And so there are a lot of reasons we're concerned about this, because H5N1 has the potential to mutate. It can lead to what we call pandemic influenza. That's not great. We want to avoid that. And the more viruses spread, as we've talked a lot about during COVID, the more potential opportunities they have to mutate, because that's all random. But every time they reproduce, there's the chance for an error to occur, and that error can lead to that mutation. And if a mutation occurs randomly that allows that virus to now infect people more easily, then you can see person to person spread, and you could see that grow. So we want to get ahead of that. Now, that's kind of where the milk conversation comes into play, because historically in the US, we pasteurize our milk. Our pasteurization is a process that has been in practice for over 150 years. It was
Wow.
developed in the 1800s by Louis Pasteur. That's why it's called
Oh,
pasteurization,
that makes
right? You've
sense.
heard of
Got
him.
it. Yes.
Um, and this was one of the greatest microbiological advancements. Basically, what we do, and we do this for other products, not just dairy, but the milk is heated very quickly to about 161 degrees Fahrenheit. So it's not even to boiling temperature. It's
Mm.
kept there for about 15 seconds and then it's rapidly cooled. And what that does is it keeps it enough to kill any disease causing bacteria and inactivate any disease causing viruses that might be in that milk. But it does it so quickly and it doesn't heat it up to the point where you would actually interfere with the nutritional content of the milk. So after that's done, now the milk is stable and safe for consumption. So we know during this spring report about the H5N1 that they were detecting traces of H5N1 in pasteurized milk. And of course, headlines went haywire. And those fragments weren't actual virus. Basically, what they were saying was, okay, we detected these remnants of the virus, which means that these cows were infected and they were shedding the virus in their milk. But because of the pasteurization, that flu virus wasn't living, so it couldn't infect
Oh,
people.
okay.
Now, we can't say the same thing for unpasteurized milk. That's raw milk. And in fact, we are seeing reports that they're detecting H5N1 in raw milk. And that's obviously a concern because that means that these cows are infected. They are
Mm.
theoretically spreading the virus within cattle herds, could spread it to other animals like pigs on a farm. Pigs are a really great mixing vessel for flu viruses, and that's not great for the potential mutations. And it's also a concern for humans. Now, right now, humans don't have the optimal flu virus receptors in our digestive tract, which is a good thing because if people were consuming that raw milk, that would be really high risk. But we have some of those receptors in our respiratory tract. So it doesn't mean that, you can't theoretically get infected by being near raw milk or drinking raw milk. And that includes for your farm workers who are maybe handling raw milk and it's, spraying around in the environment. So that's only one of the many reasons why we don't want to drink raw milk, and a
Yeah.
reason that the US has actually been pasteurizing milk for over 100 years, because we want to reduce the spread of things in milk that can cause illness. And that's this, avian flu, but it's also a lot of bacteria and other viruses. And they're in milk because they live in cows or they live in the environment that cows live in. And so they can get into the milk supply. And those things can cause very, very nasty illness.